The moment everything burned. There is a specific kind of silence that follows destruction, not the silence of peace, not the silence of rest, the silence that settles after you have said something you cannot unsay, done something you cannot undo, or made a decision in 3 seconds that will cost you 3 years. It is the silence of a room after the door slams, the silence of a phone screen after the message is sent, the silence inside your own chest when the adrenaline finally drains, and what remains is the wreckage you made with your own hands. I know that silence. I have sat inside it more times than I want to count. I have sat inside it after I ended a conversation that should have been a turning point and turned it instead into a wound. After I walked out of a meeting that could have changed my career because someone said something that landed wrong, and my body decided, before my mind had any say, that fight was the only option. After I watched a relationship I had spent years building collapse in a single evening because I could not hold myself together long enough to think. The worst part was never the consequences. The consequences were bad, but the worst part was the clarity that arrived after, the sudden, brutal lucidity that follows every reactive episode like a shadow, the moment when you can see exactly what you should have said, exactly what you should have done, exactly how small the gap was between what happened and what could have happened. If only you had been able to pause, if only you had been able to choose. That gap, that narrow, almost invisible space between what hits you and how you respond. That is what this audiobook is about. Not anger management, not breathing exercises, not the kind of self-help advice that sounds good in a podcast and dissolves the moment real life applies pressure. This is about something deeper and more demanding than any of that. This is about the fundamental architecture of human response, why we react the way we do, what is actually happening in our bodies and brains when we lose control, and how it is possible through understanding and practice to reclaim the territory between stimulus and response as your own. Viktor Frankl, who survived 3 Nazi concentration camps and built one of the most important psychological frameworks of the 20th century, wrote that between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose. In our choice lies our growth and our freedom. He was not speaking metaphorically. He was speaking from the interior of the most extreme human suffering imaginable, and what he found there was not despair, but agency, the radical, irreducible capacity of the human mind to decide how to respond, even when it cannot decide what happens to it. Most of us live lives infinitely less extreme than Frankl's, and yet most of us surrender that space daily, hourly, in traffic, in email threads, in conversations with the people we love most. We surrender it not because we are weak, but because no one ever taught us it existed. No one ever showed us the mechanism. No one ever explained that what feels like an uncontrollable flood of emotion is actually a sequence of biological events, events with a structure, a timeline, and crucially a point of intervention. That is what I learned, not in a seminar, not by reading the right book in the right order. I learned it the way most people learn the things that actually change them, through enough pain that the alternative became non-negotiable. I was 34 years old the first time I understood, really understood, that my reactions were not me, that the surge of heat I felt when challenged, the impulse to cut, to dominate, to exit, none of that was my character. It was my conditioning. It was chemistry. It was a nervous system that had been shaped by years of specific experiences to respond to specific triggers in specific ways, and that had never once been asked whether those responses were actually serving the life I was trying to build. They were not. I had a marriage that was bleeding out slowly because my wife had learned, through hard experience, that certain topics would activate a version of me she could not reach. Not a cruel version, not an abusive one, just a closed, defended, reactive version that could not hear her without hearing threat, could not receive feedback without preparing counterattack, could not sit inside discomfort without needing it to stop immediately. She was not asking for perfection, she was asking for presence, and I kept showing up as a defense mechanism wearing a husband's face. I had a professional life that worked well when conditions were favorable and fractured under pressure. I was good at what I did. I was not good at being questioned about what I did. The difference between a competent professional and a great one, I would eventually learn, has almost nothing to do with technical skill and almost everything to do with the capacity to receive difficulty without becoming it. And I had a relationship with myself that was defined by a pattern I could see clearly only in retrospect. I would act. I would regret. I would promise to do better. I would act again. The cycle was not dramatic. It did not involve screaming or violence or anything that would have been legible to an outside observer as a problem. It was quiet and corrosive, and it had been running so long I had stopped questioning whether it could be different. It could be different. This audiobook is the architecture of that difference. What you are going to hear over the next several hours is not a motivational argument. It is not an invitation to feel better about yourself. It is a precise and demanding examination of the mechanisms that drive human reactivity, combined with a framework for interrupting those mechanisms at the level where they actually operate, not in the mind, but in the body, not in the intention, but in the wiring. You will understand the neuroscience of what happens in your brain during a reactive episode, what fires, what shuts down, why your intelligence becomes temporarily inaccessible at the exact moment you need it most. You will understand why this is not a character flaw but a design feature, and why understanding the design is the only honest path to changing the output. You will meet the Stoics, not as ancient philosophers collecting dust in academic libraries, but as practitioners of a rigorous mental technology that modern neuroscience has spent the last 3 decades accidentally validating. What Epictetus taught enslaved and free alike, what Marcus Aurelius practiced while running an empire, what Frankl rediscovered in the camps, all of it points to the same fundamental truth about the architecture of human response. You will learn to map your own triggers with the precision of someone who has decided to take them seriously, not to avoid them, not to suppress them, to understand them well enough that they lose the automatic, reflexive power they currently hold over your decisions, and you will build something, not a personality transplant, not a false calm that costs you your aliveness, something more useful and more honest than either, a practiced capacity to inhabit the space between stimulus and response, long enough to ask one question: is this the response that serves the life I am actually trying to build? That question, asked consistently, changes everything. I know because it changed everything for me. Not overnight, not linearly, not without backsliding, without failure, without nights when the old circuitry fired, and I watched myself react before I could intervene, and had to sit again inside that specific silence, the silence after. But with time and with practice, the gap widened, the pause became available, and the version of myself that I had been promising to become, the one who could be challenged without fracturing, who could absorb difficulty without becoming difficult, who could stay in the room and stay in the conversation and stay present for the outcomes that actually mattered. That version became, slowly and unmistakably, the one who showed up most often. That is the journey this audiobook documents. It is yours to take. Wired to react picture the last time you lost it. Not necessarily a dramatic explosion. It could have been subtle. A sharpness in your voice that you heard yourself and regretted immediately. A withdrawal. A door closed a little too firmly. A response typed and sent before any part of you that knew better had a chance to weigh in. Or it could have been larger. A confrontation that escalated far beyond what the original issue warranted. A decision made in fury that you spent months trying to reverse. Now picture the moment just before. The specific instant when something external, a word, a tone, a look, a piece of news, a silence that went on a beat too long, made contact with something internal. The moment of impact. What happened in that gap? Most people, when asked this question honestly, say some version of the same thing. It was instant. There was no gap. One moment I was fine. The next I wasn't. There was no choice involved. It just happened. That experience is real. What it describes, however, is not the absence of a gap. It is the absence of awareness of the gap. The gap exists. It exists in every human being, in every reactive episode, without exception. What varies is not whether the gap is there, but whether the person inside it has any access to it. Understanding why requires a brief and important journey into the architecture of the brain you are using right now. The human brain is not a single unified system. It is a layered structure built across millions of years of evolutionary history, and different layers operate on radically different timescales and with radically different priorities. The layer that makes you capable of reading this, of planning your week, of weighing long-term consequences against short-term gratification, the prefrontal cortex, the seat of what we loosely call rational thought, is the newest addition. It is metabolically expensive, relatively slow, and critically, not always in charge. Below it, and older by a considerable margin, sits the limbic system. At the center of the limbic system, doing work that is essential to your survival and deeply problematic to your relationships, is a small, almond-shaped structure called the amygdala. The amygdala does not think. It does not reason. It does not weigh options or consider consequences, or ask whether your response to this situation aligns with your values and long-term goals. The amygdala does one thing with extraordinary speed and efficiency. It scans incoming sensory information for threat and, when it detects something that matches its threat templates, it activates. That activation is not a suggestion, it is a command. It triggers the release of stress hormones, cortisol, adrenaline, that prepare your body for the three ancient responses to threat: fight, flee, or freeze. Your heart rate increases. Blood flow is redirected from the prefrontal cortex toward the large muscle groups. Your vision narrows. Your hearing becomes selective. And your cognitive bandwidth, your capacity to access nuance, to think in complex terms, to remember who you actually want to be and how you actually want to behave, contracts sharply. This is what neuroscientist Daniel Goleman famously called the amygdala hijack. The emotional brain overrides the thinking brain. And it does so not because your brain is broken, but because your brain is working exactly as designed for an environment that no longer exists. The threat templates your amygdala uses were calibrated primarily in early life, shaped by the specific experiences that your particular nervous system registered as dangerous. For your evolutionary ancestors, those templates were calibrated for genuine physical threat, predators, rival groups, environmental hazards. The amygdala's speed was not just useful in that context, it was the difference between survival and death. 100 milliseconds of additional deliberation could be 100 milliseconds too many. You are not your ancestors. The threats that activate your amygdala today are, in most cases, not threats to your physical survival. They are threats to your ego, threats to your status, threats to your sense of being seen and respected and valued. A dismissive email from your manager, a tone from your partner that sounds like contempt, a colleague who takes credit for work that was yours, an unexpected criticism delivered in public, a conversation where someone refuses to concede a point you know to be correct. None of these will kill you, but your amygdala does not know that. Your amygdala is not reading the situation with the sophisticated contextual awareness of your prefrontal cortex. It is matching incoming data against patterns and responding to the match. And the match it finds in a dismissive email is close enough to the match it would find in a genuine physical threat that it fires with equivalent urgency. The result is that you bring the full biochemical force of a survival response to a situation that requires, at most, a measured professional reply. This is not a metaphor. This is physiology, and understanding that it is physiology is the first and most important step in working with it rather than being worked by it. Joseph Ledoux, one of the world's leading researchers on the neuroscience of emotion, spent decades mapping the neural pathways involved in fear and threat response. What his work revealed is that there are two distinct routes by which sensory information reaches the amygdala. The first route is long. It passes through the cortex, allows for complex processing, and takes more time. The second route is short. It bypasses the cortex almost entirely and delivers a rough, fast, low-resolution signal directly to the amygdala. Ledoux called this the low road. The low road is why you flinch before you think. It is why your chest tightens before your mind has finished processing what was said. It is why, in the moments that matter most, your body is already in motion before your intelligence has had any chance to weigh in. This is the mechanism you are working with, not against, with, because the low road cannot be disabled. The amygdala cannot be removed from the equation. What can be changed, and what this entire framework is built around, is what happens next. The amygdala fires, the chemicals release, the body activates. That sequence is not under your voluntary control. What happens in the 3, 5, 10 seconds that follow, that is where your agency lives. Most people never learn this distinction. They experience the activation as identical to the response. They feel the surge and they express the surge because they have never been shown that the surge and the expression are separate events with a gap between them. A gap that, with practice and with understanding, can be widened from a fraction of a second into something you can actually move around in, something you can make decisions inside of. That widening is not accidental, it is not temperamental, It does not belong only to people born with unusual self-control or emotional stability. It is a skill. It is built through specific practices applied consistently over time. And it begins, as all real change begins, not with a technique, but with a reckoning, a clear-eyed understanding of the system you are operating inside and what it actually cost you when you let it run without oversight. The cost is worth examining honestly. Think about the decisions you have made in states of high emotional activation, the messages sent in anger that changed the temperature of a relationship, the commitments made in excitement that your calmer self would never have agreed to, the withdrawals enacted in hurt that were meant as protection and became instead as walls, the opportunities missed because a moment of irritation or defensiveness closed a door that might otherwise have stayed open. Now consider that every one of those decisions felt in the moment, not just justified but necessary. That is the particular cruelty of the amygdala hijack. It does not feel like a hijack. It feels like clarity. It feels like finally telling the truth, finally protecting yourself, finally refusing to accept something unacceptable. The biochemistry of threat activation is experienced subjectively as righteous certainty, the feeling of being right, the feeling that this, right now, is the moment to act. And then the chemicals clear, and the clarity arrives, and you are sitting inside that silence again. The goal of everything that follows is not to eliminate the activation. The goal is to create enough space between the activation and the response that your full intelligence, and not just your oldest and fastest instincts, can participate in what happens next. The goal is to make your responses a product of your choices rather than your chemistry. That goal is achievable. The path to it begins with understanding, as precisely as possible, what is actually happening in the body and brain during a reactive episode, not at the level of metaphor but at the level of mechanism. The chemistry of losing control. You are standing in a wise conversation that has gone wrong. Maybe it started as a discussion about something practical, a work project, a household decision, a disagreement about how something was handled, and somewhere in the middle of it, something shifted. A word landed poorly. A tone changed. Someone said something that contained or seemed to contain a judgment about your competence, your intentions, your worth, and the conversation that was about a thing became a conversation about you. Something happened in your body at that moment. Before you named it, before you decided how to respond, before any conscious process had a chance to engage, something happened. A heat in the chest, a tightening of the jaw, a sudden acceleration of thoughts arriving faster than you could organize them, each one angrier and more certain than the last, or perhaps the opposite, a hollowing out, a withdrawal, a sudden distance from yourself and from the room. That something has a precise chemical signature. When the amygdala fires its threat signal, it activates the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the HPA axis, which is the body's primary stress response system. The hypothalamus sends a signal to the adrenal glands, which sit just above the kidneys, and within seconds those glands are releasing a cascade of hormones into the bloodstream. Adrenaline, also known as epinephrine, arrives first. Its job is immediate mobilization. It accelerates the heart rate, dilates the airways, increases blood flow to skeletal muscle, and decreases it to non-essential systems like digestion and, critically, the prefrontal cortex. Cortisol follows, the slower and longer-lasting stress hormone, sustaining the physiological state of alertness and readiness. This cascade is not subtle. You feel it. The physical sensations of emotional activation, the racing heart, the flushed face, the shallow breathing, the clenched jaw, the trembling that sometimes arrives in the hands. These are not psychological symptoms. They are the direct physiological consequences of a specific hormonal event. Your body is being chemically prepared for conflict or flight, and here is the element of this that most people never fully reckon with. You cannot think clearly while this is happening. This is not a figure of speech. Research by neuroscientist Amy Arnston at Yale has demonstrated that even mild, uncontrollable stress causes a rapid and significant impairment of prefrontal cortex function. The neural connections that allow for complex reasoning, for impulse control, for the consideration of future consequences, they are literally less functional in states of high cortisol and adrenaline. The brain you are trying to use to navigate a difficult conversation is not the same brain you have access to when you are calm. It is a degraded version, operating with reduced access to its most sophisticated capacities. This is why you say things you do not mean, not because you are dishonest, but because the part of you that filters speech through the question of whether this is actually what I want to communicate has been temporarily taken offline. It is why you make commitments you will later regret, why you escalate when de-escalation was available, why you choose the response that feels most satisfying in the moment and most costly in the morning. The cortisol problem does not end when the immediate trigger passes. This is something that is not well understood outside of clinical settings and deserves attention here. Cortisol has a half-life in the bloodstream of approximately 20 minutes, which means that a significant reactive episode can leave elevated cortisol levels circulating in your system for 30 to 40 minutes after the triggering event has resolved. During that window, your threat sensitivity is heightened. Your threshold for interpreting neutral information as threatening is lowered. You are, in a chemical sense, primed for reactivity, which is why people in conflict so often find that one argument bleeds seamlessly into the next. Why a difficult morning at home can color a professional interaction hours later. Why the person who snapped at you at 9 o'clock is a different person to navigate at 11 than they would have been had you caught them fresh. Understanding this has practical consequences that go beyond self-awareness. If you have had a significant reactive episode and you know the cortisol window has not cleared, the most strategically intelligent thing you can do is delay any consequential decision or communication, not because you are avoiding the issue, because you are waiting for the full capacity of your intelligence to become available before you deploy it. This is not weakness. This is the application of biological knowledge to the management of outcomes you actually care about. There is a related phenomenon worth understanding here, one that operates at a longer timescale but with equally important implications. Chronic stress, the kind produced by sustained life pressure rather than discrete threatening events, maintains elevated baseline cortisol levels that fundamentally alter the brain's processing architecture over time. Research has consistently shown that chronically elevated cortisol is associated with reduced volume and connectivity in the prefrontal cortex and with increased reactivity in the amygdala. In plain terms, sustained stress makes you easier to trigger and less capable of managing your responses to those triggers. The chemistry of a difficult life literally reshapes the hardware of your response system. This is not fatalistic information. The brain retains its capacity for change, what neuroscientists call neuroplasticity, throughout adulthood, and the changes wrought by chronic stress are not permanent if the conditions that produce them change. The practices you will develop through this framework work, in part, by creating the neurological conditions that reduce baseline reactivity and strengthen the prefrontal circuitry that makes non-reactive response possible. They are not just behavioral strategies. They are, at the level of biology, brain training. But before the training can begin, one more chemical mechanism demands understanding. Because cortisol and adrenaline, as consequential as they are, do not fully explain the experience of being in the grip of strong emotion. They explain the activation. They do not fully explain the particular texture of the reactive state, the sense of absolute certainty, the feeling that everything you are feeling is justified and real and demands to be expressed. That texture has a different chemical signature. When the limbic system is highly activated, it produces a state that researchers sometimes describe as emotional flooding. In this state, the subjective experience of the emotion, its felt urgency, its sense of pressing reality, is amplified beyond what the rational mind can easily counteract. This is partly a function of the hormonal cascade already described, and partly a function of the way emotionally charged memories and associations are retrieved in states of high activation. The amygdala is not just a threat detector, it is also an archivist of emotional memory. When it fires in response to a current trigger, it simultaneously activates stored memories that are emotionally similar: older wounds, earlier humiliations, previous occasions when something similar happened and hurt. The result is that the reactive person is never just responding to what is in front of them. They are responding to what is in front of them, plus every emotionally resonant memory their amygdala has filed under the same category. A dismissive comment from a colleague today carries the weight of every dismissive comment from every authority figure in the speaker's entire history. A perceived rejection in a relationship activates not just the present wound, but the accumulated emotional residue of every prior rejection the person has experienced. This is why reactive responses are almost always disproportionate to their immediate triggers. It is why people who love each other can wound each other with a ferocity that neither intended and neither understands in the aftermath. It is why the feeling in the moment is so consuming and so certain, because the feeling is not sized to the present situation. It is sized to the entire history of similar situations, compressed and delivered all at once. Knowing this does not automatically change the experience, but it fundamentally changes the interpretation of the experience. The next time you feel the disproportionate surge, you have a choice in how you understand it. You can interpret it as confirmation that the present situation is as dire as it feels, that the intensity of the feeling is evidence of the seriousness of the threat, or you can interpret it as information about your history, as a signal that this particular type of situation activates deep material worth understanding and working with deliberately rather than expressing impulsively. That interpretive choice is not small. It is the beginning of the entire practice, because the moment you can hold the possibility that what you are feeling, though real and intense, might be only partially about what is in front of you, that moment is the beginning of the gap, the beginning of the space, the beginning of the territory that this audiobook is teaching you to inhabit. The half-second that changes everything. In 1983, neuroscientist Benjamin Libet conducted an experiment that shook the foundations of how we understand human agency. Libet asked participants to flex their wrist whenever they felt the urge to do so, and to note the exact position of a clock's second hand at the moment they became consciously aware of the urge to move. Simultaneously, he measured the electrical activity in their brains. What he found was startling. Brain activity associated with the preparation for movement, what researchers call the readiness potential, began approximately half a second before participants reported any conscious awareness of wanting to move. The brain had begun preparing the action before the conscious mind knew it was going to act. The implications of this finding were debated intensely in philosophy and neuroscience for decades, and they remain contested. But one implication has held up across subsequent research and has direct practical significance for everything we are discussing here. Consciousness arrives late to the action sequence. The body moves before the mind reports wanting to move, and this means that the moment of conscious awareness, the moment when you actually know that an impulse is arising, is not the beginning of the sequence. It is a point within the sequence, which means it is a point of intervention. Libet himself recognized this. In later interpretations of his work, he proposed that while consciousness may not initiate action, it may retain the capacity to veto it. The conscious mind might not be the author of the impulse, but it can be its editor. The half-second between the preparation signal in the brain and the execution of the action is not nothing. It is a window, small but real, and navigable by a trained mind. This is not just laboratory science. This maps directly onto the experience of non-reactivity as practiced by everyone from Stoic philosophers to contemporary elite performers. The discipline is not to eliminate the impulse, the reactive urge, the explosive feeling, the desire to cut or withdraw or escalate. The discipline is to catch it in that window, to notice the preparation before the execution, to stand in the half-second and make a choice. What makes this possible in practice is that the physiological signals that precede a reactive response are detectable, if you have learned to pay attention to them. Chemistry we explored in the previous chapter does not arrive silently. It arrives with somatic markers, physical signals in the body that, for most people, are present and consistent and perfectly readable once they have been learned. Research by neuroscientist Antonio Damasio has elaborated what he calls somatic markers, bodily sensations that are associated with emotional states and that arise before cognitive processing is complete. Damasio's work, summarized in his landmark book, Descartes' Error, demonstrated that decision-making is not a purely rational process, and that emotional signals carried in the body play a constitutive role in how humans navigate choices. What this means for the practice of non-reactivity is significant. The body speaks before the mind does, and the body speaks in a language that is consistent, learnable, and actionable. Your somatic markers for reactive activation are specific to you, but there are common patterns. For many people, the first signal is in the chest, a tightening, a heat, a sudden heaviness. For others, it is in the throat, a constriction, a shift in breath. For others, it is in the jaw, the hands, the stomach. Some people notice a change in how fast their thoughts are arriving. Some notice a narrowing of attention, a tunnel vision quality where the triggering element suddenly fills the entire field of awareness and everything peripheral disappears. Whatever your specific somatic signature, it arrives before the behavior. It arrives in the window. And the central practice of non-reactivity is learning to recognize it there, not in retrospect after the behavior has already occurred, but in real time, in the gap, where it is still information rather than consequence. This recognition is not automatic. It requires a quality of attention that most modern adults have not cultivated because modern life consistently rewards speed over depth and output over awareness. We are trained, culturally and professionally, to move fast, to decide quickly, to perform decisiveness as competence. Pausing to notice what is happening in your chest before you respond to a challenging email is not a habit that professional culture encourages, which is precisely why people who do it gain a competitive advantage that their peers cannot easily account for or replicate. The half-second limit identified is not fixed at half a second. It is expandable. The practice of mindfulness, which is at its core the practice of sustained, non-judgmental attention to present moment experience, has been shown in a substantial body of research to increase the functional gap between stimulus and response, not metaphorically, but measurably. A 2011 study by Sarah Lazar and colleagues at Harvard showed that experienced meditators had measurably more gray matter in regions of the prefrontal cortex, associated with attention regulation and self-awareness, than control groups. The practice literally changes the hardware. But mindfulness is not the only path, and for many people it is not the most accessible entry point. The expansion of the gap can also be achieved through the practices that follow in this framework, through the deliberate mapping of triggers, through the construction of decision rules created in advance for high activation situations, through the development of what we will later call strategic delay. These practices work through different mechanisms but produce similar outcomes, a widening of the available space between the stimulus and the response. What is essential to understand right now before we move into the mechanics of practice is this: the goal is not detachment. The goal is not to become a person who does not feel. People who do not feel are not non-reactive. They are dissociated, cut off from the emotional information that is, when properly used, among the most valuable data available to a human being. Emotions are not the enemy of good decisions. Unexamined, unmanaged emotions that express themselves automatically and without oversight. Those are the problem. The goal is the full integration of emotional information with rational processing. The goal is to feel deeply and respond wisely, to let the emotion inform the response without dictating it, to use the energy of the activation, because there is energy there, real and considerable, in service of your actual intentions rather than in defiance of them. The half-second is where that integration happens or fails to happen. It is the most consequential interval in human social life. It is the space where character is actually formed, not in grand gestures or stated intentions, but in these tiny, repeated, almost invisible decisions about whether to let the impulse run or to redirect it toward something better. Every person who has built a life they are genuinely proud of has learned to live in that half-second, not perfectly, not without failure, but with enough consistency and enough practice that the pause becomes available most of the time, and when it is not, they know how to return to it. The science is clear. The possibility is real. What remains is the understanding of what the people who mastered this knew that the rest of us are still learning, what Stoics knew that neuroscience proved. Marcus Aurelius was the most powerful man in the known world. He commanded the Roman Empire at its peak, its armies, its territories, its treasury, the lives of millions of people across 3 continents. He had access to every material comfort that the ancient world could produce. He was surrounded at all times by people whose professional function was to anticipate and satisfy his every preference. By any external measure, he had every reason to be whatever he wanted to be, including reactive, including indulgent, including the kind of ruler that history records with grim frequency, a man who confused power with permission. He was none of those things. Every morning, often before dawn, Marcus Aurelius sat alone and wrote, not correspondence, not imperial decrees. He wrote to himself, a sustained, disciplined examination of his own mind, his own impulses, his own tendencies toward frustration and irritation, and the specific vanities that he knew resided in him and that he refused to let govern him. He called no one to account in those pages. He held no one responsible for his failures but himself. He returned, again and again, to the same central practice, the distinction between what was within his control and what was not, and the commitment to pour his full energy into the former while releasing his grip on the latter. Those private notebooks survived. We call them meditations. They are among the most psychologically sophisticated texts in the Western tradition, and they read, with remarkable precision, like the journaling practice that contemporary cognitive behavioral therapy might prescribe. This is not a coincidence. Stoicism, the philosophical school founded in Athens around 300 BC and developed by thinkers including Zeno of Citium, Epictetus, Seneca, and Marcus Aurelius, was not primarily a metaphysical system. It was a practical technology for the management of the self. Its central insight, the one that animates everything else in the tradition, is this: events do not disturb us. Our judgments about events disturb us. The source of suffering is not what happens, but the meaning the mind assigns to what happens. And meaning is not a fact about the world. It is a construction of the mind, and constructions can be reconstructed. Epictetus, who was born into slavery and spent his early life under the ownership of a man who apparently enjoyed breaking his leg to demonstrate power, developed this insight with particular force. In his Enchiridion, a word meaning handbook, he opens with a distinction that is deceptively simple and almost infinitely deep. Some things are in our power, and some things are not. Our power are our opinions, impulses, desires, and aversions. Not in our power are our bodies, our reputations, our positions, and everything else that depends on external circumstances. The path to freedom, Epictetus argued, runs entirely through the first category. You cannot control what happens to you. You can control how you assign meaning to what happens to you. You can control what you do with the space between what hits you and how you respond. That space, which Frankl would rediscover 2,000 years later in a Nazi concentration camp, is the only space in which human freedom is actually located. In the 2nd century AD, this was philosophy. In the 21st century, it is neuroscience. The cognitive reappraisal, the deliberate reinterpretation of an emotional stimulus in ways that alter its emotional impact, has been one of the most studied phenomena in effective neuroscience over the last 2 decades. Research by James Gross at Stanford University has established cognitive reappraisal as one of the most effective emotion regulation strategies available to human beings, with measurable effects not just on subjective emotional experience, but on the physiological markers of emotional arousal, heart rate, cortisol levels, amygdala activation. When you reappraise, when you deliberately consider an alternative interpretation of a triggering event, rather than accepting your initial reactive interpretation as the final truth, you are not engaging in denial. You are not telling yourself that the thing that happened did not happen, or that it does not matter. You are recognizing that your initial interpretation is one construction among several possible constructions, and that different constructions produce different emotional and physiological states, and that different states produce different quality decisions. The Stoics did not have fMRI scanners. They did not know about the amygdala or the HPA axis or cortisol half-lives, but they understood, with extraordinary precision, the functional architecture of the human response system. They understood that the feeling of certainty that accompanies strong emotion is not evidence of accuracy. They understood that the urgency that reactive states produce is almost always inversely related to the quality of the decision it pushes you toward. And they understood that the practice of questioning your own interpretations, not from a place of weakness or self-doubt, but from a place of rigorous, intellectual honesty, is among the most powerful tools available to anyone who wants to live deliberately rather than reactively. Seneca, writing letters to a young friend named Lucilius over the last years of his life, returned repeatedly to a single practical recommendation: create distance. Not physical distance, though that sometimes helps. Cognitive distance. The deliberate introduction of space between the event and the evaluation of the event. He wrote of a practice he called the view from above, the deliberate effort to see one's current situation from a wider perspective, to place the immediate irritant or frustration in the context of the whole of one's life, of the whole of human history, of the vast indifference of time. This is not escapism. It is calibration. It is the recognition that most of what activates the reactive system in daily life is, in the full perspective of a human life, minor, not nothing, but minor, and the practice of deliberately accessing that perspective during activation does not diminish the seriousness with which you treat what matters. It clarifies which things actually matter by removing the cortisol-fueled certainty that everything is equally urgent and equally threatening. The Stoic practice of negative visualization, the deliberate contemplation of loss, of worst-case scenarios, of the impermanence of what we hold dear, was designed partly for this purpose, not to induce anxiety, but to prevent the complacency and entitlement that make every friction feel like catastrophe. A person who has genuinely contemplated the possibility of losing something they love responds to its inconveniences very differently than a person who treats its presence as a given. The Stoics understood that gratitude and equanimity are not emotional temperaments you are born with. They are practices you build deliberately, through specific cognitive exercises applied with consistency. Modern psychology has validated this insight, with a body of research on what is variously called gratitude practice, cognitive diffusion, and perspective taking. The mechanisms differ slightly from study to study, but the consistent finding is the same. People who regularly practice deliberate reappraisal, who build the cognitive habit of examining their interpretations rather than accepting them uncritically, show measurably reduced emotional reactivity, better decision-making under stress, and greater subjective well-being over time. The Stoics were not calm people by nature. This is important to understand because the popular image of Stoicism as cold emotional detachment is a profound misreading of the tradition. Marcus Aurelius wrote extensively in the Meditations about his irritability, his impatience, his frustration with the people around him, his tendency toward vanity. Seneca described his own anger with unflinching honesty, naming specific episodes and examining them with the same rigor he applied to philosophical problems. Epictetus, who had more reason than most to be consumed by bitterness and resentment, explicitly rejected those states, not because he did not feel them, but because he understood they were a prison, a surrender of the only freedom he possessed to the people who had taken everything else. They were not calm. They became more capable of choosing calm. That is the entire difference. And that difference, between being naturally calm and becoming capable of choosing it, is the heart of the practice this audiobook is building toward. You are not being asked to be someone you are not. You are not being asked to stop feeling. You are being asked to stop letting the feeling decide for you, to stop treating the first interpretation as the final one, to stop allowing the chemistry of threat activation to masquerade as clarity, when it is, more often than not, the exact opposite of clarity. The Stoics knew this. Neuroscience proved it. And now the question is, what you are going to do with it. The anatomy of a trigger. There is a sentence your brain knows by heart. You have never written it down. You have probably never said it out loud. But your nervous system has it memorized with a precision that would embarrass most scholars. It goes something like this. When X happens, I become Y. When someone questions my judgment in front of others, I become defensive. When someone is late without explanation, I become cold. When I feel overlooked, I become either explosive or withdrawn. When I sense that someone does not respect me, I become a version of myself I do not like. That sentence, your specific version of it, is your trigger profile, and until you have examined it with the same deliberate attention you would give to any other system you were trying to understand and improve, it will continue to run automatically underneath your awareness, producing outcomes that you experience as if they happen to you rather than through you. A trigger is not simply an event that causes an emotional response. That definition is too broad to be useful. By that definition, everything is a trigger, and a word that describes everything describes nothing. A trigger, in the precise sense that serves this practice, is a specific category of stimulus that activates the amygdala's threat response at a magnitude disproportionate to the actual threat level of the situation. It is a stimulus that has, through experience and conditioning, been tagged in your nervous system as dangerous, not necessarily physically dangerous, but dangerous to something you value enough that your threat detection system treats it as survival relevant. That something is almost always one of a small number of core concerns. Research in attachment theory and social psychology has consistently identified a cluster of fundamental human needs whose perceived violation reliably produces threat activation in the social brain. The need for respect and recognition, to be seen as competent and valued by others. The need for fairness, to be treated according to rules that apply equally to everyone. the need for autonomy, to have meaningful control over your own choices and direction, the need for belonging, to be included, accepted, and not rejected, the need for status, to occupy a position relative to others that feels commensurate with your sense of your own worth. These are not weaknesses. They are not character flaws. They are human universals, present in every culture and every individual to varying degrees. The problem is not having them. The problem is not knowing you have them clearly enough to recognize when they are being activated and not having deliberate strategies for responding when they are. Your specific trigger profile is the map of which of these concerns is most sensitive for you, which specific categories of event reliably activate each concern, and what the characteristic behavioral response to each activation looks like. And that profile is not random. It is biographical. It was written by your specific history, the specific experiences that taught your nervous system which categories of event to treat as threatening and which not. The person who was consistently shamed in front of peers in childhood has a particularly sensitive trigger in the area of public criticism. The person who grew up in an environment of unpredictable loss or abandonment has a hair trigger in the area of perceived rejection. The person who survived by being invisible, by staying small and not attracting negative attention, may have a trigger around visibility and success that manifests as self-sabotage rather than explosive reactivity. The person who had to fight for everything they earned, who was told repeatedly that they were not enough, carries a sensitivity to perceived disrespect that other people, who had their worth more consistently affirmed, simply do not have. This is not an invitation to explain yourself away. Understanding the biographical roots of your triggers is not the same as excusing the behavior they produce. It is, however, essential to treating them honestly. You cannot change what you cannot accurately see. And what most people see when they are in a reactive episode is the trigger, the external event that seems to be the cause. What they do not see, because it requires a kind of interior archaeology that most people have never been taught to do, is the structure beneath the trigger, the specific need being activated, the specific history that made that need so sensitive, the specific story the nervous system is telling about what this moment means. That archaeology is worth doing, not once, in a moment of philosophical inquiry, but systematically, as a deliberate project of self-knowledge that you return to over time, each time with slightly more precision and slightly more compassion than the last. Here is how it begins. Think of a recent reactive episode, not the most dramatic one in your history. Start with something recent and specific. Hold the memory in detail, where you were, who was there, what was said or done, and what happened in you in the moments after contact. Now ask not what happened, but what it meant to you, not the intellectual answer, the felt answer. What did this situation seem to say about you, to you, in the moment of maximum activation? That felt meaning is the core of the trigger. It is rarely about the surface content of the situation. It is almost always about identity, about a statement, implicit or explicit, about your worth, your competence, your lovability, your right to be treated with dignity. The colleague who dismisses your contribution in a meeting is not, on the surface, a threat to your survival. But if the felt meaning of that dismissal is you don't matter here, and if your nervous system has a deep file labeled with that sentence, assembled from years of specific experiences, then the activation is not disproportionate to the felt threat. It is perfectly proportionate to it. The disproportionality is between the felt threat and the actual threat, between the story and the reality. Once you can see the story, you can begin to examine it. And once you can examine it, you can begin to decide whether it is the story you want to continue living by. This is not fast work. It is not the work of a single chapter or a single listening. It is the work of ongoing, honest, patient self-examination, the same work that Marcus Aurelius was doing alone before dawn every morning for years. The meditations are not the record of a man who achieved equanimity. They are the record of a man practicing it, failing at it, returning to it, practicing it again. What they communicate, across 2,000 years, is not the destination but the dedication, the willingness to keep examining rather than to stop looking. Your trigger profile, once mapped with reasonable accuracy, gives you something invaluable that you did not have. Before anticipation, you can know in advance which categories of situation are high risk for you, which conversations are likely to activate which concerns, which environments or relationships carry which specific sensitivities. And that knowledge is not just self-awareness for its own sake. It is operational intelligence. It allows you to prepare, to enter high-risk situations with your attention already oriented toward the moment of activation, rather than being surprised by it. It allows you to create decision rules in advance in the calm, rational state, rather than improvising in the heat of the reactive state when your cognitive resources are least available. It also, and this is something that deserves more attention than it typically receives, allows you to extend some compassion to the people around you, because if your triggers are biographical, so are theirs. The person who reacted to you in a way that seemed excessive, disproportionate, irrational, they are also running a nervous system shaped by specific experiences, activated by specific concerns that may have nothing to do with the surface content of your interaction. Understanding this does not mean accepting poor treatment. It means recognizing that most human conflict is not actually between people. It is between people's old stories, colliding in the present. That recognition does not make the conflict disappear, but it changes the register in which you can engage with it, from threat to complexity, from combat to navigation. The anatomy of a trigger is not a clinical topic. It is the interior landscape of every human relationship. Learning to read it, in yourself first, and then in others, is the foundation of everything that follows. Building the pause. Every skill you have ever built in your life followed the same developmental arc. There was a phase of incompetence so complete that the skill seemed impossible, when you got behind the wheel of a car for the first time, and the coordination of hands and feet and eyes and attention required to simply move it forward in a straight line seemed like something no human being could reasonably master. There was a phase of conscious effort so demanding it felt like carrying something heavy through unfamiliar terrain. There was a phase of increasing fluency, where the skill started to cost less and deliver more. And then, eventually, a phase of automaticity, where what had once required your full deliberate attention became something your nervous system handled without consulting your conscious mind at all. Building the pause follows the same arc. It begins with what feels like nothing. No gap, no space, just the stimulus and the response collapsed together. It moves through stages of effortful practice that feel awkward and incomplete, and it arrives, for those who stay with it long enough, at something that feels almost like a different way of being in the world, a reliable access to a breath, a beat, a moment of choice that is simply there, available most of the time when you need it. The word pause is doing a lot of work in this framework, and it is worth being precise about what it means and what it does not mean. The pause is not hesitation. It is not timidity. It is not the social performance of calm that some people mistake for the real thing, the tight-jawed, forced neutral expression of someone suppressing rather than managing. Suppression, as emotion researchers have consistently documented, is among the least effective emotion regulation strategies available. It does not reduce the physiological arousal of emotional activation. It adds to it by layering the effort of concealment over the energy of the emotion itself, and it tends to produce leakage, the emotion finding its way into behavior through channels the suppressor does not control or even notice. The pause is something different. It is a genuine and brief suspension of the automatic response sequence, not to deny what is being felt, but to create enough temporal space for more of the person to participate in what happens next. It is the moment in which the reactive system's first answer, the one produced by the amygdala and the low road before the cortex had a chance to weigh in, is acknowledged but not immediately enacted. It is the moment in which you remember that you have a choice. How do you build it? The foundation is somatic awareness, the practiced ability to detect the physical signals of emotional activation in real time in your own body, before the behavioral response has been initiated. We touched on somatic markers in an earlier chapter. Here we are going to get specific about the practice. The practice begins outside of high activation situations. This is critical and often overlooked. Most people try to develop this capacity in the middle of the situations where they most need it, in actual conflict, in actual pressure, in the actual moments of activation, which is equivalent to trying to learn to swim while drowning. The training environment needs to come first. Set aside 10 minutes daily, not as a formal meditation practice if that does not suit you, though that can be useful, but as a simple body scan. Find a quiet moment, sit comfortably and move your attention deliberately through your body. Notice what is present. The quality of your breathing. Is it shallow, constricted, full, easy? The state of your jaw, your shoulders, your hands. The temperature and density of sensation in your chest. The quality of your gut. You are not trying to change anything during this scan. You are learning the baseline, what your body feels like in a neutral state, so that deviations from that baseline become detectable. Most people who do this regularly for the first time are surprised by what they find. The baseline is rarely as neutral as they assumed. Chronic tension in the jaw or shoulders they had stopped noticing. A persistent constriction in the chest they had normalized. A low-level agitation in the gut that had become the background noise of their experience. These findings are not alarming. They are informative. They are the beginning of the somatic literacy that makes real-time detection possible. Once you have established a baseline awareness, the practice extends into lower-stakes activation. A mildly frustrating interaction, a small disappointment, a moment of impatience in traffic or in a slow checkout line. These are the training reps. They are situations where the emotional activation is real but not overwhelming, where the gap between stimulus and response is narrow but crossable, and where the cost of a less-than-perfect execution is low. In these moments, the practice is simply to notice, to catch the first somatic signal of activation, wherever it appears in your body, and to name it, internally, before doing anything else. Not to analyze it, not to act on it, just to notice and name it. That's activation. Something shifted. Something changed. I can feel it here. This act of noticing and naming has a specific neurological consequence that has been documented across multiple studies. When you apply language to an emotional state, when you name what you are feeling with any degree of specificity, you activate the prefrontal cortex and modulate amygdala activity. The labeling does not eliminate the feeling. It interrupts the automatic pathway from feeling to behavior. It inserts, briefly, the involvement of the thinking brain where before there was only the reactive brain. Matthew Lieberman at UCLA has conducted research demonstrating that the act of affect labeling, putting feelings into words, significantly reduces amygdala activation and increases prefrontal cortex engagement. Participants who labeled emotional stimuli showed reduced reactivity compared to those who simply viewed them. The simple act of naming is an act of regulation. This is why journaling, when practiced consistently, is not merely an introspective exercise. It is a neurological training tool. The regular practice of putting emotional experiences into language builds the neural pathways that make labeling available under pressure, in the moment, where it is needed. Marcus Aurelius was not just philosophizing in those pre-dawn hours. He was, in a very real neurological sense, training the circuit. The next layer of the practice is breath, not as mysticism, as physiology. The respiratory system is the only component of the autonomic nervous system that is both involuntary and under voluntary control. You breathe automatically, without thinking about it, all day and all night. But you can also consciously alter the rate, depth, and rhythm of your breathing, and that alteration has direct and measurable effects on the autonomic state of your nervous system. Specifically, extending the exhale relative to the inhale activates the parasympathetic nervous system, the branch of the autonomic system associated with rest, recovery, and the downregulation of threat activation. A breath pattern in which the exhale is twice as long as the inhale, 4 counts in, 8 counts out, or any variation of this ratio, reliably shifts the nervous system away from sympathetic activation and toward parasympathetic recovery. Heart rate decreases. Cortisol levels begin to fall. Prefrontal function, which was compromised by the arousal state, begins to recover. One extended exhale does not undo a significant amygdala hijack, but it does something important. It creates a physical anchor, a brief interruption in the momentum of the reactive sequence that gives the prefrontal cortex a slightly longer window in which to re-engage. Combined with the labeling practice, it is a two-step intervention that takes less than 15 seconds and that, practiced regularly in lower-stakes situations, becomes available as a reflex in higher-stakes ones. The pause is built-in practice. It is not a concept you can think your way into possessing. It is a capacity developed through repetition in progressively more challenging situations until it is as available to you as any other practiced skill, not infallible, not effortless, but reliably there, most of the time, when the situation asks for it. There is one more element of building the pause that does not get enough attention in most frameworks that address this topic. That is the practice of post-episode review. Every reactive episode you experience, every time the pause failed to materialize, every time the automatic response ran before you could intervene, is data. Expensive data sometimes, painful data, but data. The question the post-episode review asks is precise. At what point in the sequence did I lose the gap? Was there a somatic signal I missed? Was there a moment where I had awareness of the activation and chose to proceed anyway? Was the situation one I had identified as high risk in my trigger profile? And if so, had I prepared for it? The review is not self-punishment. It is not rumination. It is conducted in the calm that follows. With the same forensic curiosity you would bring to any other system failure, you were responsible for understanding and preventing. It is conducted briefly, 10 minutes at most, and it ends with a single forward-looking question. What one thing would I do differently in an identical situation? That question, asked honestly and consistently, is how the pause is extended over time, not through willpower, through learning, logic as a weapon. There is a version of this conversation that almost no one has out loud. It goes like this. I know what the right thing to do is. I know that reacting impulsively will cost me. I know that holding my position, staying measured, taking the long view, I know that is the correct move, and I cannot do it, because in the moment, what I know stops mattering and what I feel takes over completely, and the gap between my knowledge and my behavior is so consistent and so humiliating that I have quietly stopped trusting myself. If you have had some version of that conversation, you are in the majority, and the reason the knowledge is not enough, the reason that understanding the neuroscience, agreeing with the philosophy, wanting to change does not automatically produce change, is that knowledge lives in the prefrontal cortex, and the reactive state takes the prefrontal cortex offline. The information is there. It just becomes temporarily inaccessible at the exact moment you need it. The solution to this problem is not more knowledge. It is pre-positioned logic. Pre-positioned logic is the practice of making decisions in advance, in the calm, rational, fully resourced state, and encoding those decisions in formats that remain accessible in the degraded cognitive environment of emotional activation. It is the application of your intelligence to your own reactive patterns before the patterns activate, rather than trying to apply intelligence in the moment when the amygdala is running the show. This is not a new idea. It is, in fact, one of the oldest applications of strategic thinking to human behavior. Ulysses, in the myth, knew that he would lose the capacity for rational decision-making when he heard the siren's song. He did not trust himself to be reasonable in the moment, so he pre-positioned his decision. He had himself tied to the mast before the ship reached the siren's waters, and he instructed his crew to ignore his commands until they were safely passed. He used the intelligence he had now to constrain the behavior of the compromised self he knew he would become. This is sometimes called the Ulysses contract in behavioral economics, and research has consistently demonstrated its effectiveness across a range of domains where present self and future self have conflicting interests. The principle is simple and powerful. When you know that a specific situation will compromise your decision-making capacity in a predictable direction, commit in advance to a specific course of action that your compromised self cannot easily override. For the practice of non-reactivity, this means identifying your high-risk trigger categories, the specific types of situations where your reactive system has the most momentum and your prefrontal resources are most likely to be overwhelmed, and creating decision rules for each of them, not general intentions. Specific if-then protocols. The format matters. Research on implementation intentions by psychologist Peter Gollwitzer has shown that behavior change is dramatically more effective when it is encoded as specific situational plans. If situation X arises, I will do Y, than when it remains as a general goal or intention. The specificity of the if-then format creates a strong mental link between the situation and the planned response, making the response more accessible in the moment of activation. Precisely because it does not require deliberation, it has already been deliberated. The decision was made. The reactive moment becomes the execution of a pre-existing plan rather than the improvisation of an overwhelmed mind. Your decision rules for high activation situations might sound like this. When I am in a conversation that is escalating, and I feel the signal in my chest that I have learned to recognize as threat activation, I will ask one clarifying question before I say anything. Assertive. Not because the clarifying question is always the right tactical move. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it is not. But because it creates a mandatory pause between activation and response, and because asking a question is infinitely less costly than most of what the reactive system would produce left to its own devices. Or, when someone criticizes my work in a group setting, I will not respond in that meeting. I will say, "Let me think about that and come back to you," and I will return with my response once the cortisol has cleared and I can access the version of my intelligence that actually serves me well in professional contexts. That rule does not require bravery in the moment. It requires only the execution of a decision already made. Or, when a conversation with my partner is starting to feel like an argument and I notice the familiar narrowing of my attention and acceleration of my thoughts, I will say, "I need 5 minutes," and I will take those 5 minutes, not as abandonment, not as stonewalling, but as a deliberate biological reset that will make the conversation I return to infinitely more productive than the one I would have if I stayed. John Gottman, whose decades of research on couples at the University of Washington constitutes the most rigorous science of relationship dynamics that exists, has documented the physiological flooding that occurs during escalating conflict and its devastating effects on the quality of communication and problem solving. He found that once heart rate crosses approximately 100 beats per minute, the capacity for the kind of listening, nuance, and emotional attunement that productive conflict resolution requires is effectively lost. What remains is defensive, attack-oriented, and almost guaranteed to make the situation worse. His recommendation, which maps precisely onto the prepositioned logic framework, is to agree with your partner in advance, in a calm moment, on the protocol for calling a timeout when flooding is detected, not mid-conflict, when the protocol itself becomes a weapon, in advance, when both people can agree that the goal is resolution rather than victory. Logic as a weapon is not aggression. It is the disciplined deployment of your own intelligence in service of your own interests, the recognition that your reactive self is not your ally, that the chemistry of activation is not on your side, and that the most strategic thing you can do with the intelligence you have access to right now is to build structures that will protect you from the intelligence you will not have access to later. This extends beyond interpersonal conflict into every domain where emotional activation compromises decision quality. Financial decisions made in states of excitement or fear, career decisions made in the heat of humiliation or resentment, health decisions made under the acute stress of a bad diagnosis. In every domain, the same principle applies. Use the clarity you have now to pre-position the decisions you will need to make when clarity is compromised. The calm, rational self is the most reliable version of you that exists. Its job is not just to navigate its own moments. Its job is to protect you during the moments when it will not be available. Building a personal decision protocol for high activation scenarios is among the most high leverage activities available to anyone working seriously on non-reactivity. It requires time, honesty, and a willingness to acknowledge your specific vulnerabilities, which scenarios reliably take you offline, and in what direction. It does not require perfection. A protocol that you execute imperfectly 70% of the time is vastly superior to no protocol at all, because 70% of the time is 70% fewer reactive episodes, 70% fewer silences, after, 70% more outcomes that align with your actual intentions, the logic you bring to your own. Reactions is among the most consequential uses of your intelligence that exists, not the logic you apply to professional problems or financial calculations or strategic planning. The logic you apply to the one system that shapes every other outcome in your life, the system of your own response. That system is running right now. The question is who is operating it? The long game. Ask yourself what you are actually optimizing for, not in the abstract, not in the language of mission statements and life philosophies, in the specific granular texture of how you spend your days, in the micro decisions about how you respond to difficulty, how you treat people who frustrate you, what you do with the energy of your anger and your hurt and your fear. When you trace those micro decisions back to the implicit value system that is actually driving them, what do you find? Most people, when they are honest about this, find that they are optimizing for relief, for the immediate reduction of discomfort, for the feeling that they have responded, have been heard, have not allowed themselves to be treated in a way they consider unacceptable. The reactive response serves all of these in the short term. It feels like justice. It feels like dignity. It feels like the refusal to absorb something that should not have been directed at you. And in the long term, it frequently costs you everything you are actually trying to build. This is the fundamental tension at the heart of emotional reactivity. The immediate reward of the reactive response is real. The hit of relief when you say the cutting thing when you exit the room, when you send the message that makes clear exactly what you think, that is a genuine neurochemical event. The dopamine and the adrenaline create a feeling of resolution that the calmer, more strategic response does not produce in the same way or on the same timeline. The long game does not feel as good as the short game in the moment. This is not a weakness. It is the structure of the problem. Behavioral economists call this temporal discounting, the well-documented human tendency to value immediate rewards more heavily than future rewards, even when the future rewards are objectively larger. The discount rate varies by individual and by context, but the pattern is universal. We are built to weight the present heavily and the future lightly, and emotional activation increases that discount dramatically. Under stress, the future becomes even more abstract, even less motivating, even less capable of competing with the urgent demands of the present feeling. Understanding this does not defeat temporal discounting, but it does allow you to work with it deliberately. The practice of the long game begins with a simple but demanding exercise, making the future concrete, not conceptual, concrete. Not I want to have better relationships, but what specifically does a better relationship with the person I most struggle with actually look and feel like in vivid detail? What kind of conversations would we have? How would the quality of our communication differ from how it is now? What would that relationship make available in my life that is currently inaccessible? Not, I want to be more effective professionally, but what specifically would my professional life look like if I consistently brought my full intelligence to high-pressure situations instead of my reactive system? What opportunities would that open? What reputation would it build? What would I be capable of that I currently am not? When the future is that specific, it begins to compete more effectively with the present. Not perfectly. The present always has an advantage in the temporal discounting calculation. But the gap narrows when the future is vivid and concrete rather than abstract and aspirational. The long game also requires an honest accounting of what reactivity has already cost, not as self-punishment, as investment analysis. What has the reactive pattern already extracted from you? Which relationships are thinner, more defended, more distant than they would otherwise be because someone, maybe you, maybe them, probably both, learned through experience that certain topics would produce defensive or aggressive responses? What professional opportunities failed to materialize because a moment of irritation or defensiveness communicated something about your stability that closed a door? What do you know about how the reactive version of you is perceived by the people whose respect you most want? These are not pleasant questions. They are important ones, because the cost of reactivity is rarely dramatic and singular. It is chronic and cumulative. It is the relationship that functions at 60% of its capacity because neither person feels fully safe to be honest. It is the reputation that carries a quiet asterisk, brilliant but difficult, capable but volatile, worth the investment only when conditions are good. It is the internal life that includes a persistent low-level guilt, a recurring awareness of the gap between the person you are capable of being and the person you actually showed up as in the moments that mattered. The long game is the recognition that you are building something, that every interaction, every response, every moment of choosing restraint over reaction is a brick in something, a relationship, a reputation, a character, a life, and that every reactive episode is not just a cost in the moment, but a withdrawal from the account of what you are building. Sometimes a small withdrawal, sometimes a large one, occasionally one that permanently changes the balance. Marcus Aurelius governed an empire and returned to his private notebook every morning to examine whether his behavior the previous day had been worthy of the emperor he was trying to be. Not because emperors were held to a higher standard than other people. Marcus believed deeply that the same standard applied to everyone, slave or emperor, which is why Epictetus, born into slavery, was among his most important intellectual influences. but because Marcus understood that the distance between the person he was capable of being and the person who actually showed up in difficult moments was not fixed. It was a function of practice, of attention, of the daily, unglamorous work of catching the impulse before it ran and asking, calmly and honestly, whether acting on it served the life he was actually trying to build. That work does not produce dramatic transformation stories. It does not offer the emotional arc of a crisis overcome and a hero reborn. It offers something quieter and more durable, the slow accumulation of a life that more and more closely resembles the life you actually chose, populated by relationships that bear the marks of how you actually treated people in the moments when it was difficult to treat them well. The long game is not for everyone. It asks you to accept the felt cost of the pause, the absence of the immediate relief, the sometimes discomforting experience of staying regulated in situations that your entire nervous system is telling you to respond to with everything you have. It asks you to trust, on the basis of evidence and logic, that the investment is worth making even when the return is not immediately visible. But for the person who has sat enough times inside that silence after, the specific silence that follows a reactive episode, looking at what they made with their own hands, the long game eventually stops feeling like sacrifice. It starts feeling like the only game worth playing. Relationships, rewritten. Every relationship you have is a system, not in the cold mechanical sense, in the precise sense that a system is a set of elements that interact according to patterns, and that those patterns, once established, develop a momentum of their own that is largely independent of the conscious intentions of the people inside them. You and your partner, you and your closest friend, you and the colleague you find most difficult, you and your parent. Each of those relationships runs on a set of interaction patterns that were established over time, through accumulated experience, and that now operate with something close to automaticity. You do not decide in each new encounter how to behave with this person. You mostly execute the pattern. The pattern includes your triggers. It includes theirs. It includes the specific topics that reliably produce friction, the specific dynamics that reliably produce escalation, the specific sequences. She says this, he does that. She responds with this, he withdraws, that both people know by heart, even if neither has ever articulated them explicitly. The pattern is the relationship, in the sense that the relationship is mostly what the pattern produces. Changing the pattern requires only one person to change. This is counterintuitive, and it is important. Most people in difficult relationships wait for the other person to change first, to become less critical, less withdrawn, less defensive, less reactive, before they are willing to change their own contribution to the dynamic. The wait is understandable. It is also, almost always, indefinite, because the other person is waiting for you. Systems theory has a well-established principle. A change in any element of a system changes the system. When you alter your behavior in a relational pattern, not superficially, not performatively, but in a way that is genuine and consistent, the pattern cannot continue unchanged. The other person's behavior was calibrated in part to your behavior. When your behavior shifts, the calibration is off. The old responses no longer produce the old results. The system is forced to find a new equilibrium. This does not mean that every relationship can be repaired through unilateral change. Some relationships have structural incompatibilities that no amount of individual growth can bridge. Some people are genuinely unwilling or unable to shift their own patterns regardless of what you do. The principle does not guarantee outcome. What it does guarantee is that your behavior is the only variable in any relationship that you actually control, and that investing your energy in changing it is the only investment with a guaranteed return, because the return includes not just the potential change in the relationship, but the certain change in you. The application of non-reactivity to relationships is where the practice becomes most demanding and most consequential, because the people who trigger us most reliably are, almost always, the people we love most. The relationship where the stakes are highest is also the relationship where the nervous system's threat detection is most sensitive, where the accumulated history of past hurts creates the thickest emotional residue, where the gap between stimulus and response is narrowest. The practice that feels manageable with a difficult colleague becomes genuinely hard with a partner, whose tone on a particular subject can move you from calm to activated in under 3 seconds. John Gottman's research identified 4 patterns of interaction that he found to be the most reliable predictors of relationship deterioration, patterns so consistently associated with relationship failure that he called them the 4 horsemen: criticism, attacking the person rather than the behavior; contempt, communicating from a position of superiority through sarcasm, eye-rolling, mockery; defensiveness, responding to a complaint with a counter-complaint, refusing to acknowledge any validity in the other person's experience; and stonewalling, withdrawing from interaction entirely, shutting down communication as a form of self-protection. All 4 of these are products of the reactive system. All 4 are responses that the amygdala-hijacked brain produces with notable efficiency, and all 4, occasionally not in extreme cases but consistently, predict deterioration in the systems where they appear. The antidotes Gottman identified are also, without exception, products of the regulated prefrontal state: gentle startup instead of criticism, appreciation and shared positive regard instead of contempt, taking responsibility for your contribution instead of defensiveness, physiological self-soothing, which is exactly the pause we have been building, instead of stonewalling. The regulated state is not just personally beneficial, it is relationally generative. The person who can stay present in a difficult conversation, who can hear criticism without becoming criticism, who can acknowledge another person's experience without treating it as an attack on their own, that person does not just have better relationships, they create them. They create the conditions in which other people feel safe enough to be honest, vulnerable enough to actually connect, trusting enough to invest in a future together. This is not a soft skill. In an era when the ability to form and maintain genuine human connection is increasingly rare and increasingly valuable, the person who has developed the capacity for sustained, non-reactive presence in relationship has something that cannot be faked, cannot be automated, and cannot be replicated by anyone who has not done the actual work. Rewriting a relationship pattern begins with a decision that is made alone, in advance, before the next difficult encounter. The decision is this: I am going to bring something different into this system, not because the other person deserves it or has earned it or has changed first, because I have decided that the pattern we have been running is not producing the relationship I actually want, and I am the only variable I control. That decision is an act of power. It looks like patience. It looks like restraint. It looks, to the outside observer and sometimes to the other person, like nothing at all, like a conversation that did not escalate, like a moment that passed without the usual friction. But it is the most consequential kind of agency available in any relationship, the agency of choosing, in the moment of maximum activation, to be the person you decided to be rather than the person the pattern expects you to be. The pattern will resist. Old systems do not yield without testing the new element. The first time you don't react the way you always have, the other person may escalate, may push harder, may deploy the tactics that have always worked before. This is not malice. It is the system attempting to restore its equilibrium. Hold the new behavior through the testing phase, and the system will find its new equilibrium, one that you designed, rather than one you inherited. When the world wants you to break, there are environments that are specifically designed to produce reactive behavior, not with malicious intent in every case, though in some cases, yes, more, often with the simple mechanics of competition, pressure, and incentive structures that reward emotional provocation and punish composure. The person across a negotiating table who introduces a last-minute demand they know will feel like a betrayal. The manager who delivers criticism in a group setting when a private conversation would have served the stated goal equally well. The colleague who sends the email that could only have been written to produce a specific defensive response. The news environment, the social media ecosystem, the political discourse, all of it calibrated through the ruthless optimization of engagement metrics to maximize emotional activation, because emotional activation drives attention, and attention drives revenue. You are swimming in a provocation environment. The stimuli designed to trigger reactive responses are not occasional or incidental. They are the ambient background of contemporary life, and the people who have learned to navigate that environment without being continuously operated by it have an advantage that compounds over time in every domain they inhabit. The first thing to understand about adversarial provocation, the kind that is deliberate, strategic, and designed to move you into a reactive state for someone else's benefit, is that its power depends entirely on your participation. A provocation that does not produce the intended reactive response is not a provocation. It is just behavior. The emotional manipulation that someone attempts on you fails completely if you understand what it is and choose not to execute your part of the script. This is easier to say than to do. The provocation is effective precisely because it targets your specific sensitivities, often because the person attempting it knows you well enough to know which triggers have the most momentum. A skilled manipulator does not choose random subjects to press. They choose the subjects where your nervous system's threat response is most sensitive, the topics where the gap between stimulus and response is narrowest, the areas where your self-concept is most vulnerable to challenge. Knowing this gives you something useful. Your triggers, which we have been working to map throughout this framework, are also your points of vulnerability to deliberate manipulation. The person who knows that you are particularly sensitive to perceived disrespect, who has observed that criticism in front of others produces a defensive response that can be leveraged, who understands that a particular tone of voice will reliably activate your childhood material about not being taken seriously. That person can operate you like an instrument if you are not aware of your own architecture. The awareness changes the equation. When you can feel the activation and recognize simultaneously that this activation may have been engineered, that the goal of the person or the system provoking you is to move you into a state where your behavior serves their interest rather than yours. That recognition is itself a form of the pause. It is the moment when the question shifts from what do I feel to what is actually happening here, and whose interest does my reactive response serve. In high-stakes professional environments, negotiations, competitive situations, adversarial conversations, this question is among the most tactically important you can ask. The party that loses composure first in a negotiation has typically lost significant ground, not because composure is inherently virtuous, but because the reactive state produces poor tactical decisions. It reveals information about priorities, about pain points, about what you are willing to accept, that a composed counterpart can use. It forecloses options that a calm mind would have seen. It communicates vulnerability in precisely the contexts where vulnerability is most costly. Robert Cialdini's research on influence and persuasion documented extensively how emotional activation is weaponized in commercial and social contexts to override rational decision-making. The artificial urgency of a limited time offer, the social pressure of a room full of people who appear to have already decided, the fear-based framing that makes inaction seem more dangerous than action. All of these are designed to move the target into a state of emotional activation where the prefrontal cortex's capacity to evaluate options carefully is compromised. All of them are less effective. On a person who has developed the practice of noticing activation and pausing before executing the response the activating stimulus was designed to produce. The world's provocation environment also includes something more diffuse and more personally intimate than deliberate manipulation. It includes the accumulated weight of difficult circumstances, the sustained pressure of a demanding job, a struggling relationship, financial stress, health concerns, the specific exhaustion of being a functioning adult in a world that does not stop requiring things of you. Chronic stress, as we established, degrades the hardware of your response system. It raises baseline cortisol, sensitizes the amygdala, and reduces the functional capacity of the prefrontal circuitry that the pause requires. This means that the practice of non-reactivity cannot be separated from the practice of recovery. Sleep, which research has consistently shown to be among the most powerful regulators of emotional reactivity. Insufficient sleep produces increases in amygdala reactivity of up to 60% in some studies, is not a luxury. It is the literal restoration of your capacity to inhabit the pause. Exercise, which reduces baseline cortisol and increases the production of neurotransmitters associated with mood regulation and cognitive function, is not separate from the emotional mastery practice. It is part of it. The management of your biological inputs is as much a part of this framework as the cognitive and behavioral practices, because the biology is the substrate on which everything else runs. When the world wants you to break, and it will repeatedly, through its provocations and its pressures and its specific expertise in finding the gaps in your composure, the response is not to harden. Hardening is brittleness dressed as strength. The response is to build the kind of resilience that comes not from being impervious to impact, but from being able to return, consistently and with decreasing recovery time, to the regulated state from which good decisions are made. That return is the practice, not the absence of activation, the capacity for return. Every reactive episode that you recover from quickly, examine honestly, and learn from specifically is not a failure. It is a training rep. The measure of progress in this practice is not how rarely you are activated. It is how quickly and how skillfully you come back. The identity shift. Everything we have covered so far, the neuroscience, the philosophy, the practices, the protocols, can be understood and applied as a set of external tools. Techniques you pick up and use when needed. Strategies you deploy in high-risk situations. Skills you develop and refine over time. That understanding is not wrong, but it is incomplete, because the deepest and most durable change that this practice produces is not in your behavior. It is in how you understand yourself, in the story you tell about who you are and what you are capable of, in the identity from which your behavior flows. Identity is not a fixed fact. It is a working model, a continuously updated story that the mind constructs about the nature of the self, and that powerfully shapes behavior by defining what is consistent, what is possible, and what is required. The person who carries an identity of "I am someone who loses it under pressure" behaves differently in high-pressure situations, not just because of that belief, but because of that belief. The identity generates the expectation shapes the interpretation of ambiguous stimuli, and the interpretation produces behavior consistent with the identity. It is a self-fulfilling architecture. James Clear, in his work on habit formation, identified identity as the deepest layer of behavior change, deeper than outcomes, deeper than processes. He observed that the most durable behavioral changes are those that are connected to a shift in self-concept. Not "I am trying to exercise more," but "I am someone who takes care of their body." Not "I am working on my reactions," but "I am someone who responds to difficulty with intelligence rather than impulse." The distinction is not semantic. It is structural. When the identity shifts, the behavior that is consistent with the new identity becomes easier because it is no longer a departure from the self. It is an expression of it. And the behavior that is inconsistent with the new identity becomes harder because it creates cognitive dissonance, a felt inconsistency between how you behaved and who you understand yourself to be. The identity shift in the context of this practice sounds like something specific. It is the move from "I am a reactive person working on my reactions" to "I am someone who thinks before responding." From "I tend to lose control under pressure" to "I am someone who performs best when conditions are most demanding." From "I have a short fuse" to "I have learned to use the energy of strong emotion strategically." These are not affirmations. They are not the positive thinking exercises that psychology research has consistently shown to be ineffective or actively counterproductive for people with low self-esteem. They are new working models, adopted provisionally and tested through behavior, that become more solid with every piece of behavioral evidence that supports them. Every time you execute the pause, every time you catch the activation, name it, breathe through it, and respond from a place of choice, rather than chemistry, you generate a piece of evidence for the new identity. Every time you apply your pre-positioned logic in a high-risk situation, and the outcome is measurably better than what the reactive response would have produced, you generate more evidence. The identity shift is not a decision made once. It is a conclusion earned through accumulated evidence and updated continuously as the evidence accumulates. This has an important implication for how you relate to your failures. In the old identity, "I am a reactive person," every reactive episode is confirmation. It is evidence of the essential, permanent nature of the thing you are trying to change. It reinforces the identity that makes change harder. In the new identity, "I am someone who is building this capacity," every reactive episode is data. It is information about where the practice still needs work, which triggers have the most momentum, which situations require more preparation. It is not confirmation of permanent limitation. It is feedback in a developmental process. The identity shift also changes how you present yourself to others, and this matters more than it might initially seem. We are relational creatures, and the identities we hold are supported or undermined by the expectations that the people around us carry about who we are. The person who has been reactive in a specific relationship for years is known in that relationship partly as a reactive person. The people in that relationship have adapted to that reactive person. They have learned what to bring and what not to bring, what to expect, and what to protect themselves from. When you change, you are not just changing your own experience. You are changing the relational ecology in which your identity has been known. That ecology will resist the change. As we discussed in the relationships chapter, people who have known you as reactive will test the new behavior, not to be cruel, but because the inconsistency between the new behavior and the old identity is cognitively dissonant for them too. They are not sure yet whether the change is real or temporary. They are watching to see whether the new behavior holds under pressure. This testing phase is not an obstacle to the identity shift. It is the confirmation of it. Every time the test is applied and the new behavior holds, the new identity becomes more legible to the people in your life. Every time they update their model of who you are, and you can see it happening in the gradual relaxation of their defensiveness, in the topics they begin to bring that they used to protect themselves by avoiding. The identity shift is being ratified by the relational world. The person you are becoming is not a performance. It is not a managed presentation of a self that underneath remains unchanged. It is the actual development of new neural pathways, new habits of attention, new patterns of interpretation, new decision structures, new behavioral defaults. It is a genuine change in the architecture of response, and architecture, once built, becomes the new baseline, the place from which the next building begins. You do not arrive at the identity and stay there without maintenance. The practice is ongoing. The human nervous system does not achieve a permanent state of equanimity and stop there. Life continues to provide provocations. Old triggers retain some of their sensitivity even after years of work. The circuits built in early SWI experience do not fully disappear. They can be overridden by stronger competing circuits, but they remain available to be activated under sufficient stress. The practice is not a project with a completion date. It is a way of relating to yourself and to your experience that, once chosen, becomes the baseline from which you navigate everything else. But the identity that maintains the practice is not the same as the identity that began it. The person who started this journey in the silence after, in the specific quiet that follows a reactive episode, looking at what they made, is not the same as the person who has built, through time and repetition and honest self-examination, the reliable capacity to inhabit the space between what hits them and how they respond. The gap has widened. The pause is available. The logic is pre-positioned. The triggers are mapped. The identity has shifted. What remains is to understand what this practice is actually about at its deepest level, because it is not finally about being better in difficult situations. It is about something more fundamental than that. Mastery is not the absence of fire. Let's be clear about what we are not building here. We are not building a person who does not feel, a person who moves through difficulty with a placid expression and a heart that registers nothing, who has achieved, through practice or through damage, the kind of emotional flatness that some people mistake for mastery. That person is not a model. That person has lost something essential, the capacity for deep feeling, for anger, for grief, for passion, for the acute discomfort of caring about outcomes that are not guaranteed, is not a liability to be eliminated. It is the substrate of a fully inhabited human life. The Stoics understood this, and it is worth saying clearly, because the popular misreading of Stoicism as cold indifference has sent a lot of people down an unproductive path. The Stoic ideal was not the absence of emotion. It was what they called apatheia, which does not translate as apathy in the modern sense, but as freedom from being controlled by passion, the freedom to feel fully without being operated by the feeling, the capacity to be moved without being swept away. Marcus Aurelius grieved. He wrote about the loss of friends and children with unmistakable feeling, with the full weight of a man who loved and lost and did not pretend otherwise. What he refused was the surrender of his agency to the grief. What he practiced was the continued functioning of his judgment, his responsibility, his commitment to the people in his care, not despite feeling deeply but alongside it, because he had built the structures that allowed both to coexist. Emotional mastery through non-reactivity is not the suppression of fire, it is the directed use of it. The energy that lives in strong emotion is real and considerable. The activation that a significant threat or injustice or loss produces in the body is not neutral, it is charged, it is powerful, and it is looking for somewhere to go. The reactive person gives it the nearest available exit, which is usually the expression of the raw emotion in the direction of its immediate cause. The non-reactive person, the person who has built the pause, mapped the triggers, pre-positioned the logic, does not eliminate that energy. They redirect it into the clarity that anger can produce when it is not allowed to speak directly, but is allowed to inform, into the precision that grief can generate when it is held long enough to reveal what it is actually about, into the determination that fear can fuel when it is understood as information about what matters rather than as a command to flee. The emotions, held in the space rather than immediately expressed, become something more than their first form. They become intelligence. This is what the martial arts traditions have always understood about the energy of aggression, not that it should be denied, but that it should be received and redirected. The force of an attack taken directly produces damage. The same force redirected can be used to unbalance the attacker. The energy does not disappear. It changes direction. The same principle operates in the emotional domain. The force of a strong feeling, expressed directly in its raw form, typically produces the reactive cycle, the expression, the response, the escalation, or the withdrawal, the silence after. The same force held in the pause long enough to be understood and then expressed with direction and intention produces something entirely different. This redirection is not suppression. It is not the performance of calm over a seething interior. It is the genuine transformation of raw activation into something more refined, more specific, more true, more useful to the actual situation than the first chemical response would have been. It takes practice. It takes the pause, consistently applied. It takes the willingness to hold what is uncomfortable rather than releasing it immediately for the relief of expression. And it produces, over time, a quality of response that the people around you will experience as something they cannot quite name but can unmistakably feel, a presence that is both powerful and safe, that can absorb difficulty without being destabilized by it, that communicates, in its very texture, that it is operating from choice rather than from chemistry. That quality, the felt sense, of a person who has the fire and has chosen what to do with it, is not common. It cannot be counterfeited. It is built through exactly the work this framework describes, and it compounds over time in ways that reach far beyond the individual practice. In leadership, it is the quality that allows a room to stay calm, because the person at the front of the room is calm, not because nothing is wrong, but because the leader's regulated state communicates to every nervous system in the space that regulation is possible. Research on emotional contagion has established that emotions spread between people through mechanisms that operate below conscious awareness, through micro-expressions, vocal tone, postural cues, the subtle rhythms of interaction. The leader who loses composure does not just lose their own composure. They distribute their activation to every person in proximity. The leader who maintains composure under genuine pressure does the opposite. They create, through the contagion of their own regulated state, a group environment in which more people have access to more of their intelligence. In parenting, it is the quality that determines what your children learn about how to handle the world's difficulty, not from what you tell them, but from what they observe in you. Every time you hold the pause in front of your children, every time they see you encounter something frustrating or hurtful and respond with thought rather than impulse, they are downloading a template, not a lesson. A template. Behavioral patterns passed through observation operate at a different depth than behavioral patterns taught through instruction, because they are encoded not as information, but as lived experience. The most powerful parenting you will ever do is the management of your own reactivity in the presence of your children. In every close relationship, it is the quality that creates the felt safety for real intimacy, for the vulnerable conversations, the honesty, disclosures, the acknowledgments of inadequacy and fear that real closeness requires. People do not open to people they cannot predict. They do not share what is most tender with people whose response to difficulty might be to weaponize it. The non-reactive person, the person who has demonstrated through consistent behavior over time that they can receive hard things without becoming a hard thing in return, is the person in whose presence other people become more themselves. Mastery is not the absence of fire. It is the choice of what you set ablaze. The moment everything changed, I want to go back to the beginning. I want to go back to that specific silence, the one I described in the opening pages of this journey, the silence after. The brutal, clarifying quiet that settles when the adrenaline drains and what remains is the thing you made with your hands, the words you cannot unsay, the door you cannot unslam, the message sitting in someone else's phone that is going to cost you something. I want to go back to that silence because I want to tell you what happened there. Not what I wished had happened, what actually happened. I sat inside that silence enough times that I stopped being able to pretend it was the other person's fault. That took longer than I want to admit. The reactive mind is extraordinarily skilled at constructing narratives of justification, at assembling, from the available evidence, a case for why the response was warranted, why the other person had it coming, why the situation left no alternative. I was good at that construction. I had been practicing it for years, but the silence does not negotiate. It just sits there, holding the evidence that the court of my own conscience could not dismiss. And eventually, after enough silences, after enough evidence, I ran out of constructions that held. What I found underneath the constructions was not what I expected. I expected to find anger, or shame, or the particular kind of grief that comes from recognizing a pattern you do not know how to change. Those were all there. But underneath them was something simpler and more demanding. A question: is this who I am deciding to be? Not, is this who I naturally am? I had spent years hiding behind that framing, treating my reactive patterns as fixed features of a temperament I had been issued rather than choices I was continuously making, and had the power to make differently. Not, is this who people expect me to be, or who my history has made me, or who the situation seemed to require. Is this who I am deciding to be? That question changed everything. Not the answer, the question. Because the question contains an assumption that the preceding framing did not, the assumption that there is a decision being made, that the response is not simply what happens but what I choose, even when the choice is unconscious, even when the reactive system runs so fast that the choice is invisible. The invisibility of the choice does not eliminate it. It just makes it easier to disown. The work of this framework, the neuroscience, the philosophy, the pause, the trigger mapping, the prepositioned logic, the identity shift, all of it is, at its core, the work of making the invisible choice visible, of taking the decision that was always being made unconsciously and bringing it into the light of conscious agency, where it can be examined, evaluated, and aligned with the life you are actually trying to build. That is not a small thing. It is not an incremental improvement to an already adequate way of operating. It is a fundamental restructuring of the relationship between what happens to you and what you do with it. A restructuring that touches every part of your life because it changes the one through which all of life is filtered. My marriage did not become perfect. Perfection was never the goal, and anyone who promises it as a destination is selling something. What changed was the register of our difficulty. The arguments that had once escalated into silence that lasted days became conversations that were hard and stayed hard and came to resolution because neither of us was performing a reaction anymore. My wife did not marry a man without edges. She married a man whose edges she could now trust would not cut her when she reached for him. That trust, the slow, evidence-based trust that comes from observing consistent behavior over time, is not the same as love. It is what love is able to build on. Professional life changed in ways I had not fully anticipated. I had expected the non-reactive practice to make me better at managing difficult interactions, and it did. What I had not expected was what it would do to my capacity for sustained original work. The mental bandwidth that had been continuously occupied by the maintenance of a reactive posture, the vigilance, the defensiveness, the ongoing low-level monitoring of potential threats to status and recognition, that bandwidth, freed up, went somewhere, into problems that had previously felt too large to hold, into relationships with collaborators that became genuinely generative rather than strategically managed, into a quality of presence in the work itself that had not been possible when I was half occupied with defending my position in it, and my relationship with myself, the one that had been defined for so long by the cycle of act, regret, resolve, repeat, changed in the specific way that cycles change when one element of them is removed. The silence after is still sometimes there. I still sometimes react in ways I would not have chosen from a calm state. I am not the finished product of the practice I have been describing. I do not expect to be. But the silence is shorter now. The self-examination is forensic rather than punishing. The question, is this who I am deciding to be, arrives faster and with less resistance than it once did. And the answer, more often than before, is yes. Not because I have become a different person, because I have become more consistently the person I was always capable of being, the one who was there in the best moments, in the moments when something important was on the line, and I rose to it, when someone I loved needed me to hold and I held. That person was never absent. They were always available. What the practice built was the access, the reliable, consistent, pressure-tested access to the version of myself that I actually want to be the author of my life. Viktor Frankl wrote from inside conditions of suffering that most of us cannot fully imagine. And what he found there was not despair, but this: the last of the human freedoms is to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. That freedom, small, inner, invisible to every external eye, is the freedom that no circumstance can permanently take away. It can be surrendered. It can be forgotten. It can be operated away, stimulus by stimulus, reaction by reaction, until you have handed so much of it over to external events that the space between what hits you and how you respond has collapsed to nothing. Or it can be reclaimed, widened, practiced, made into the most lived-in territory of your interior life. The moment everything changed for me was not dramatic. It was a Tuesday morning, in a conversation that should have gone the way it always went, with the same trigger and the same chemistry and the same invisible machinery preparing the